Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 9, Episode 5. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Our special guest on this episode recorded live in the Scratch Event DJ's podcasting studio at the RevTech Annual Rev Summit in Dallas is Greg Merrill, CEO, advisor, board member, recently ex-Nike, where he was global head of digital transformation. It is actually the first of several episodes recorded at the Rev Summit. I really enjoyed our time with Greg, and you had him as well on a panel, so it was just a great event, and he's so insightful around the role of transformation. It was a great interview.
Yeah, he's a really super nice guy, first of all, but a fascinating guy with really great experience. Greg actually came on my radar screen because we were both at the NRF APAC show in Singapore in June, and we actually missed each other in person, but decided to have a Zoom follow-up call. And then I was like, maybe we should get this guy on the big stage of the Remarkable Retail Podcast. So I'm absolutely glad we did.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that is, as I said, the first of several episodes recorded in the Scratch Event DJ's studio. And in fact, we've got a couple of bonus episodes rolling out from the summit. So keep your eyes and ears open. In fact, we've got one coming up this Friday. Now, you sound a little bit different. You you attended your Harvard reunion and came away with a door prize. But how was your weekend? And I think you got back in the classroom. So did you learn anything? And how was other than the thing you're going to talk about, how was the weekend?
Well, yes, it was good news, bad news. Going for my business school reunion was actually a lot of fun, catching up with many folks that I had not seen in quite a long time, and a few that I have kept in touch with. So that was fun. And it was interesting to get back into the class. There were a couple of sessions in particular that I really enjoyed. One by Professor Francis Frey on Move Fast and Fix Things, and also David Yaffe's session on the evolution of digital platforms. So maybe we'll chat about that a little bit more at some point. But yes, not everything went according to plan.
Too much. First of all,
I got COVID, and thankfully, my symptoms are not too bad, but I have been in isolation since I got back. And hopefully by the time this episode comes out, I will be back into the wild and not contagious. The other thing that didn't go quite according to plan in Boston was that my girlfriend was supposed to come up on a somewhat later flight because I went early to see one of my nephews, which was also great to catch up with him, but she got caught up in hurricane flight cancellations. So it's very much a missed picture. But anyway, I'm back at it, feeling pretty good, and I expect to be just fine in the next day or two.
Well, that's great news because we'll be together, and you'll be together with a whole bunch of people. You'll be bulletproof then because you'll be recently COVIDed, but we'll be together at the inaugural Shop Talk event in Chicago. We'll be recording episodes in our remote or traveling podcast studio. This time will be sponsored for the third time by our friends at Bamboozer. Now, before we get to our great interview with Greg, let's dive into this week's most important retail news brought to you by Scale, the world's fastest growing enterprise commerce platform. Learn more about their solutions at scale.com. That's SCAYLE.com. Let's get to the news. So how do I want to phrase this? Kicking the container down the street. The immediate crisis of the port strikes has been resolved with what looked like a pretty big wage increase, but more to follow next year, right? So what do you make of the way that's resolved and maybe not so much resolved?
Yeah, this could, as we talked about last week, this port strike had the potential to be quite disruptive, both in terms of what consumers would face by not having the products that they desire in the stores that they enjoy, but also by some estimates, it could have cost the U.S. economy $5 billion a day. Sounds like a pretty big number to me, but yes, it's been at least temporarily averted. They agreed to, and by the way, this just for some folks that may not be as familiar with it, this port strike was going to affect the East and the Gulf Coast ports, not the Western coast because of the unions that represent the different workers. But it was the first of its kind in nearly 50 years, but it did end after only 3 days. They did agree to significant wage increases, but they did not address some of the concerns from the union about increasing automation and some working conditions. So the contract was extended to January 15th. So there are still things to be resolved. But in any case, we will not have the immediate term impact, which could really have wreaked havoc on the fourth quarter of the holiday and so forth. And I guess there's a certain amount of optimism here for the longer term because they did get largely the wage increases they wanted, and the other issues, while important, seem to be perhaps a little less contentious, and now there's several months to work on that.
So you and I were talking off mic that, one of our favorite segments, the Wobbly Unicorn Corner, we haven't done in a bit. We might need a new segment, the stalled turnaround segment. There's in the news a couple of stalled turnarounds. Let's talk first of all about JCPenney.
I don't know if you've given any thought to a music sting for this segment. I don't know if it's like a airplane engine stalling or something like that. But yes, we are seeing a number of quite well-known companies that have been working to turn themselves around in some cases for many, many years, which does bring us to JCPenney. So they reported their quarterly sales and earnings. Unfortunately, they were objectively and relatively awful. Their sales were down over 9%, which obviously in general is a very poor number. But if you compare them to the department store peers, their department store peers, Macy's, Kohl's, Dillard's, et cetera, their number is much worse than even the poor numbers from the guys I just mentioned. They also had been for a few quarters modestly profitable, but they swung into the red this quarter, and their EBITDA, for all those folks that love financial acronyms, was down 80%. Now, obviously, this is not good news in general, but I would say it's particularly bad given they are into this billion-dollar capital investment, which I know we've talked about a few other times, as well as having rolled out a bunch of new strategies. Now, it's fair to say they have not fully realized their turnaround plan, but given all the work that we put into it, given that we are now almost in November, it'll be 3 years into new CEO Mark Rosen's tenure, they do not appear to be gaining any traction at all. And in fact, things seem to be getting worse. Now, normally, I would say this would be time for full-on panic. But I guess if you want to look at the glass half full, their ownership and their balance sheet makes it a little bit less dire because they do have a relatively strong balance sheet. They are not hemorrhaging a ton of cash, though they do seem to be slowing down the pace of their revitalization. I think I mentioned this last quarter that when they announced the $1 billion investment plan, my sense was it was a little bit, because they're a private company, we don't get as much detail as we get from a publicly traded company, but my sense was they were meant to spend that $2 billion over a couple of years, but they're not spending at all at that pace. Now, as many people would know, they were bought out of bankruptcy primarily by Simon and Brookfield, which are two of the biggest mall operators, and many JCPenney locations are in malls that are owned or operated by Simon and Brookfield. So given that they are presumably not wanting to have big empty spaces, they are likely to be relatively patient. But I think there are two things, maybe three things, that might start to test their patience. One is if Penney's is actually losing money, that is a drag on the reported profitability of these two companies. And if there's not prospects of that turning around pretty quickly, I would imagine they might start to get a bit more aggressive on taking action. Second, as I mentioned, Mark Rosen's coming up on his 3rd-year anniversary, and that's a lot of time, really, to have affected some meaningful change.
You might have. I mean, if you were in Mark's shoes at that first board meeting, presenting, here's the turnaround plan, because you've been in a not dissimilar situation. You say, listen, We didn't get here overnight. This is
I
going to
didn't
take
get paid nearly as much money as he got paid. Yes, in theory, I was in somewhat similar situations.
Well, you would have probably said, "Listen, we didn't get here overnight. This is going to take like 5 years to work." Do you think he would have kind of he certainly wouldn't have said by next year we'll be fine, right? So maybe he built himself in a bit of a cushion there. What do you think?
Well, I think it would be totally reasonable to say what you said, but I gotta think that not demonstrating any real progress within a 3-year time frame, that's very concerning. I think you would have to say you're going to see meaningful progress within 3 years, but to really get things on track is going to take longer. I don't know. I think this is a pretty dire situation. As anybody who's followed my work or listened to the podcast will know, I believe that department store business is going to continue to be in contraction. Some of the issues are exacerbated by the economic headwinds, but it's mostly about the weakness of the business model. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine there won't start to be some pretty significant changes at Penney's after the holidays. I think that will mean store closings, probably mostly in the if not completely, in the non-Simon and Brookfield properties. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't look for maybe somewhat different ownership structure. And I got to think Mark's going to be, maybe month to month starting pretty soon if they don't have a significantly better fourth quarter, which I'll be shocked if they have a good fourth quarter.
Connected to that, someone I used to work with or for, and someone also Mark used to work for, Levi Strauss, stuck in neutral, I guess we could say, because they have a new leader. Michelle Gass came over from Kohl's, and talk about what you're seeing from Levi's.
Yeah, well, Michelle jumped from a really hot frying pan into maybe a simmering frying pan. But Levi's has not shown a ton of progress. This one I could say is a little bit more a function of some of the economic headwinds, but they are also trying to pull sort of a Nike in de-emphasizing wholesale channels in favor of direct-to-consumer. And in some sense, that's going pretty well. Their direct-to-consumer business, so that's both their Levi's.com business as well as their own stores, and they have quite a lot of their own stores.
A lot of stores, extensive.
They're in like 110 countries, so it's quite a vast operation, global operation. Their DTC growth was 10%, and DTC is now 44% of their total sales. Whereas wholesale was down like 9%, whatever the math is there. Yeah. And that is a function, of course, of many of their customers, like the department stores, having poor sales, but also strategically exiting some accounts. So they are in process on this strategy. So it's definitely not as worrisome a situation as the Penney's situation. But not gaining a lot of traction. Their margin did improve because of their mix towards their gross margin, I should say, did improve because of their mix shift to direct-to-consumer, but their profit and sales are basically stalled. The other big announcement out of this is that they may sell their Dockers business, basically to focus on jeans and Beyonce
well, you gotta go
over khakis, which it's easy to see that's probably a better
David
decision.
Katz.
I'm sure the investment bankers have him on speed dial. So
let's move on and talk about JD. Let's go on the upside. JD Sports sports and fashion shows the growth is possible even in a globally challenging economy. Talk about them. We met Ariane Parisi and talked to her in Barcelona, and I was impressed. And it looks like they're doing impressive things.
Yeah, so if people aren't familiar, JD Sports is a UK-based sports retailer, sports and athletic wear and fashion retailer. Very large, multi-billion-dollar company. So people on the continent and in the UK will definitely know them well. But they have been expanding, particularly in the US, largely through acquisition. They acquired Finish Line a while back. I think just closed on the Hibbett's Sporting Goods. So it's a strong business model. And the point is, I think even if the macro environment is challenging, there are plenty of retailers that have figured out how to grow faster than the averages. Their growth was close to 7%. their profits continue to trend up. So I think at least for those of us in North America, they're definitely a brand to watch. But yeah, many of our listeners will be quite familiar because they've been pretty well deployed in the UK and some other markets. But opened when I was at the World Retail Congress, they had just opened their flagship on the Champs-Élysées. So yeah, keep your eye out for both the JD brand as well as some of the nameplates they've acquired.
Well, that's a wrap on the news brought to you by Scale. Let's now move to our interview live from the RevTech Summit in Dallas with Greg Merrill.
Well, Greg, it's so exciting to, first of all, meet you in person. We've had a little bit of virtual contact, but it's great to meet you in person. Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, we are going to talk in a few minutes about where we are and what else is going on around us. But before we do that, maybe just a minute from you on who you are, your personal, professional journey, what you do now, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I've sort of walked many journeys, so I'll keep it high level. 3-time founder, accidentally stumbled into Nike. I'm coming off about a decade as an executive at Nike. And the work I'm moving into now is more on sitting on boards, advising CEOs on growth and transformation, and partnering with family offices on them moving into their direct investing strategy. So I've gotten a beautiful plethora of obsessing problems from different vantage points, which I think makes me more dangerous.
Yeah, well, we're all about transformation, at least this past year on the podcast. So that's part of the reason we want to talk to you, but also just all those different perspectives. So we'll dive into that in a minute. But we are coming to you from the Scratch Event DJs remote podcast studio here in the RevTech offices, the annual Rev Summit. So that allowed us to take advantage of doing this in person. But you and I are going to be on stage in, I guess, about an hour and a half. Anything you might want to share about what you expect the wisdom you expect to drop on stage and mostly make sure that I don't embarrass myself?
Well, I'll tell you what, Steve, as the moderator, I'm going to throw you a curveball because I'm going up on stage to see how quickly I can start a fight.
Right.
Just kidding. Maybe.
People will be reading all about this on social media.
People came for fireworks. We're not talking about anything bland here. I think the focus of what we're going to talk about, and we talked about this a little bit beforehand, was how do we reduce friction, largely in the way that consumers shop for, purchase, and ultimately receive product or goods that they've taken in. And I'm going to be talking about all the things that lead up to the process before shopping, which retailers typically ignore, and I believe has a massive impact on the business. And so, like where consumers consume their content is a huge thing. And I'll just leave you with 2 words: TikTok.
Ooh, all right.
Oh, very interesting. So we've spent and have spent over the time of the podcast, we spent a lot of time on innovation and transformation. And I want to talk about transformation with you. It's one of those words that I think has become washed out in its meaning a little bit because it's used in every, it's constant transformation. But what does transformation mean to you? And what is the call to action where an organization is transformer and need to transform? And is that a journey with an end point, or is that a constant iterative culture of an organization?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think transformation is kind of like innovation, right? It's kind of a vague term, and I think each company needs to define it for themselves, and there needs to be some wiggle room and play, within there. We've all heard change is constant. We know that. And I look at transformation from a brand or retailer perspective as how do you embrace change and do it intentionally so that your business continues to grow and stay relevant. So I like to think about transformation in 2 kind of facets, maybe. The first one is your internal economic engine, what your business does to generate economic value. And how can you continually transform that economic engine so that you're more efficient and you're capable to move faster when the world around you changes? The second facet of that transformation is expressed the way that your consumer feels it, right? And they're linked, but I look at them differently because we have more control internally over our internal processes. We don't have as much control over consumers and where they shop and where they hang out and where they consume their content and whatnot, and what features they're looking for, right? Mm-hmm. So I think once you split it into internal retooling of your economic engine and what the consumer wants to see, you can start figuring out where are your burning platforms that you say, we need to transform, intentionally change our business to meet, to meet where the consumer is going. I'll mention one. Let me mention one little example there. In Tokyo, most people live in apartments. They don't have a secure place. If they've bought something online, they don't want to ship to their house. There's no place really to put it. I'm speaking in generalities.
Sure.
So what's big? 7-Eleven and lockers, product lockers. So on your way home on the train, you can stop by 7-Eleven, grab a snack, and grab your product. Most people in the U.S. don't have that challenge. So as a global brand or retailer, you might need to think, hey, what does our consumer want and need differently because of geographic or cultural concerns there? So that's kind of one element of the
or
consumer.
competitive as well, right? I want to hang on that for a minute. Is there such a thing as kind of a table stakes versus a differentiating point in the call to action around transformation? In other words, if change is constant, and if we keep saying it's a transformation, in my mind, a transformation is a major initiative versus the kind of iterative, nonstop, things change all the time. So how do you think about that as a transformation professional, that everybody's job is to keep up with change, but your job particularly is to initiate and steer a more major initiation, and how does that, what triggers that in an organization?
I generally agree with everything you kind of laid out there, and when I think about what's the hardest part of transformation, it's the people. Transformation or technology or innovation, it's sort of a tool, right? Yeah. And it's only as good as the people whose hands it's in and what they do with it. And so whether it's kind of small incremental innovation or a large ERP overhaul where you're kind of ripping out the engine and putting a new one in, which I think I hear from you talking about that's transformation. And I absolutely agree, if I'm hearing you right, I agree with that. The underbelly of that is, how do people work? How do your employees, regardless of their function or their team, leverage internal data to make better, faster, and smarter business decisions? And I think that's almost a transformation in and of itself, right? We're not talking ERP. We're not talking new technology. We're not talking, features and things that the customer will feel as they, engage with your brand. It's how do the employees use these tools to make your business grow faster?
It's interesting because does it need to be called the transformation to get people's attention? Is that a bit like, is that culture baked into an organization where they're like, we know we got to constantly change versus, all right, we're just going to hit our heads on the windshield here. This is a transformation.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. There's almost a double-edged sword. People are afraid of change. I think it's safe to say that in general terms, people are afraid of change. And so on one hand, the CEO rally cries, we're transforming. People can get excited or they can get afraid, right, or a little bit of A and B. And so I think it's this fine line. I mean, part of what I love about working in larger teams is that rally cry, is that painting a clear vision and saying, charge, right? We're going together. And so but I know that might be my bias or my character, that I'm not afraid of change. I love it. I like it. I mean, I think that's where the future is. That's how you actively build the future of an industry or your company. But it can also be really fearful for a lot of people. So it's a fine line. It's
interesting.
Maybe another podcast.
All right. Part 2. So one of the things we've been, from somewhat of a selfish perspective, since I recently released a book on transformation, Leaders Leap, is trying to dig into why transformations are successful and why transformations fail. You may have seen the stats that McKinsey put out, that something like 70% of all transformations fail or fall well short of their goal. Bain, I believe, has kind of similar numbers. So I guess one is has that generally been your experience? But more on point is, what are those characteristics? And you touched on this a little bit, but what are some of those characteristics, particularly when it comes to really business transformation, major business design, redesign? What's your perspective on that?
I agree, and I think there's a lot of different reasons behind why transformations generally don't. Maybe I won't say fail; I'll say stick. Right? Mm-hmm. They don't stick, and largely, and tying back to the earlier point, these are massive initiatives that take time. These are multi-year initiatives generally. Sure. If you define transformation that way, I'll be honest. I don't think people and companies have the patience to stick through to the end. I think we lose focus. We lose track of priorities. We allow our priorities to shift, and we justify it by saying, well, the business is changing, the world is changing. And, one dynamic I think I'll sort of pick on specifically here is the conflict between the timelines that large-scale transformations take and executive compensation. Executives are compensated essentially quarterly. We're looking at quarterly goals. We're looking at the earnings call. How did things go? And if things don't go well, guess what? Transformation budgets, innovation budgets, they're being peeled back.
Yes.
So
I've very much had that experience. Yeah.
So I think when you just look at the fundamental nature of how corporate executives are compensated versus what it takes to get sticky transformation, they're at odds. Mm-hmm. So I think people don't want to talk about it because now you're touching people's wallets, and that can be touchy. So I get that, but look, let's say the quiet things out loud. Let's talk about the hard things because they're not going to change.
One of the things I think we see a lot, not only what you're speaking about, but the short-term focus, is if you really have a need to transform, if your core business model is either stalled or losing altitude, you got to keep the core business going and the pressure to take costs out or whatever it might be to optimize that. But then you're trying to maybe stand up something quite different. So yes, you've got the issue that tends to take a long time. But you often have kind of your own little innovator's dilemma of you need to do disruption, but you also need to optimize and protect, or at least the need. People feel the need to do that, whether that's always right or not. Have you seen that dynamic play out in some of the places you've worked in? And what would you say, beyond the incentives, beyond some of the cultural issues, to try to get that balance right between keeping the plane flying while you're trying to get another mode of transport or whatever?
This is a fantastic topic, and I'm so glad you're bringing it up. I'm gonna start. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and throw out a number, and then I'm going to explain that number. I think 50-50. Companies in general should spend 50% of their time on running the day-to-day business, which includes becoming more operationally efficient and putting out the day-to-day fires of running your business, getting the right product, right place, right time. And the other 50% is innovating and exploring the future. And that could be new business lines. That could say, hey, how do we leverage our brand, which is incredibly valuable, and go out and create an entirely new revenue stream, right? Not enough companies do that second 50%. They get so bogged down in that first 50%. And this is, the term here is ambidexterity. When you think about it at an individual human level, most people are not ambidextrous. You're either right-hand dominant or left-hand dominant. So I understand that I am saying companies should do something that is inherently very difficult for them to do, but it's important. And I think there was a stat I was remembering. 68 companies on the S&P 500 today were on it 20 years ago.
Right.
In 2004, right? So what does that tell you? Companies are being replaced. They're becoming irrelevant, and they're not able to explore and build a sustainable foundation on how to continue to grow the business and stay competitive. So ambidexterity is a beautiful topic, and that's probably a podcast 3 that we can talk about.
We got a whole series that is being spawned here.
It's our next year's summer series.
So stay tuned.
I mean, one quick follow-up as I listen to you describe, a 50% allocation of time and treasure is I think for some people listening, them like, I think this is like somebody in a corner for 10%, in a skunk's works or whatever. But that's a major investment. Is that an investment that needs to be by necessity led by I won't call them a chief transformation officer, someone who's in charge of transformation, or does that exempt everybody from thinking about transformation? And then it becomes, well, that's his or her job to figure that out, not mine. I'm just going to run the ship and let them kind of, how do you get, and we're really getting to the culture that you try to set for an organization with that, right?
You know, I think this is another double-edged sword type thing. I don't think innovation should be a function into and of itself. It can be where that team's sole mission is to go and explore and innovate for the future. And that could be related to the core business or on the outskirts, on the ancillary edges. But beyond that, I think...
Because you're going to hire different people to do that than you hire to run the business, right?
Exactly.
Different thinking, very comfortable with change.
Yep.
In fact, uncomfortable with any kind of status quo, right? It's a very different set of group of skills, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is where larger companies sometimes struggle, because the type of people that do well in those sort of innovation specific, they're kind of, there's a generalization, anti-establishment, right. Sort of,
Don't like bureaucracy.
No, they don't want to be told no, don't want to be told, like, we're going to slow things down, like, show me your business model. Like, no, we're exploring. We're not ready for that yet, know?
Right.
And so there is this conflict here. I think these teams do need to be somewhat protected from the bureaucracy that exists in the larger machine.
And the day-to-day necessity to put numbers on the board in
Bingo.
Some ways, right?
Absolutely. And your CFO's banging on the door, show me the value from the work that you're doing. I'm sorry, but we're not there yet. And so that brings up the second part of this is there has to be, whether it's a chief transformation or chief innovation officer, there has to be support from the boardroom, from the C-suite, explicit support. And when I say that, you're at an all-company meeting, your CEO needs to be saying that. Hey, this is a priority for us. We're doing it. We're putting people and budget and resources behind it. And, everybody in the company, your job is to help them succeed because they're here to help us succeed. So it has to be very explicit from the top as well as the groundswell from the organic growth there.
So you recently left Nike, a company that I imagine everybody listening is very familiar with, and a company that has had a long, proud tradition of at least product innovation, whether it's literally transformation or not, but was a company that's been embarked on a direct-to-consumer transformation. Obviously, we're not going to get into any proprietary information or any of that kind of stuff or gossipy things or what have you, but from your experience there, what would you say, to the extent Nike has been successful with quite a lot of innovation and driving transformation, what's been successful, and what do you take away from that experience and say, okay, not everything went well, here's how I'm thinking about it as you go forward with the next stage of your career?
So for me, as a former athlete and a sports lover, one of the things that Nike, I think, has done consistently well that I really appreciate is centering the athlete in everything that they do. And so when you think about product, Nike, is a product company, footwear, how do we leverage our deep relationships with the best athletes in the world to make better product, right? That's not only good for the Olympian, but also the average, weekend warrior runner wants to go and have the best product they can to have a good run. And so centering the athlete and in everything that they've done and translating that through to innovative product, I think is phenomenal. From a transformation standpoint, I think what was done really well was breaking down the economic engine of the business, the categories or the steps or the chunks of work from upstream to downstream that a company does to create financial value, economic value. Once you've chunked it out, you can do a benchmark, an analysis, and say, where are we behind? And you could be behind in everything, and that might be okay because it's in balance. What scares me is when you have an imbalance. Say your inventory management capability is very poor. Let's say it's a 2 out of 10 on a benchmark scale, and your customer service is a 9 out of 10, right? Or your consumer experiences are a 9 out of 10. That's a really big balance. And so you create sort of a weak chain there. So I think Nike had approached transformation by breaking down to the building blocks, benchmark, assessing, and say, where do we need to prioritize? and speed things up so that we're in balance and that we're constantly getting better.
So maybe not necessarily specific to Nike, but if we think about sort of the classic innovator's dilemma, and generally what we've seen, and you pointed to this in some of the stats earlier, where, I mean, I think we could talk about Starbucks, we could talk about Gap, we could talk about a lot of very big, powerful brands that have become so big that end up getting picked at around the edges. So, obviously Nike's had On and Hoka and other folks come in and pick off a piece of their core business, and maybe, I know apparel's a little bit different, but Lululemon, Vuori, you have companies that come up, and I guess I just wonder whether it's almost impossible, or what would your advice be if you're such a big company and you're trying to keep that engine going? You're inevitably going to attract competition. Somebody's going to say, well, we're not going to go after all your business. We're going to go after the 5%, that's 15% of your profits, and we're just going to do that in a really unique way. Or just frankly, sometimes I think consumers just go, I like this brand until everybody's got it, and now I want to move on to the next thing. So it may not even be so much about, oh, wow, those running shoes are actually better. They're better in the sense that they're no longer the brand, the popular brand. So I guess my question is there an aspect of this which is just sort of inevitable? It's like a gravity issue. You can't, as much as you want to try to solve it, the things that you might want to do may get you away from the things that have made you so successful over time. So sorry, that was a very long-winded question. Hopefully it makes some sense to you. You can do a better job answering it.
You want to summarize that question?
Yeah, I was going to say.
I can. Let me answer a few pieces of that. Maybe I won't get the whole thing.
If you're able to pull out anything that was relevant from that long-winded question.
I think there are two in particular. So business is cyclical. I absolutely agree. And staying competitive and relevant is the key to growing. Pairing that with, I think brand loyalty is eroding. Consumers are less worried about the logo on the in general. I'm speaking in general terms. And so for companies and brands that have traditionally relied on strong branding that drives consumers to purchase their product, they're comfortable. They can't be comfortable anymore. They have to think in a different way. And when you think about where culture is now created, it's not, going back to TikTok and how consumers consume content and create content is the other aspect. The big brands of the world need to start looking under new rocks because they're not creating culture. They're trying to catch up to it,
right?
Respond to it afterwards. So, I think getting as close to your consumer as possible, and instead of trying to be a stronger magnet, go meet them where they are.
Right.
Yeah, that's a big pivotal moment where we spend more money on marketing and we need to shout from the rooftops. Look at us and come be inspired and buy our product. No, go meet them where they are. It's a different way of thinking, and I'm smart enough to know that I don't know enough about this, but that's where the wave is coming from, and I think it's going to knock a lot of big companies down that aren't paying attention.
So in that, and one more question before I kick it back to Michael, but this idea that's been around for a long time of, disrupt yourself, I guess the one question about this in the context of a Nike or a Starbucks or some of these big brands that end up getting, hit at by some people call them mosquito brands, but some of them end up, becoming big successful brands, as we've seen, like brands like On and Hoka. Yeah. Is a possible answer to say, we can't stretch our core Nike brand or our core Starbucks brand or our core Gap brand everywhere to sort of either close off those avenues or go after them. We need to perhaps create a totally new brand under so it's a little bit like Gap, Old Navy, Athleta, et cetera. Is that, do you see that as a generally a good direction rather than to try to think you can take, a $30, $40, $50 billion brand to the next level under the same brand ethos and the same go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, it makes me think of the saying, there's riches and niches, right? So the more you can specialize and zoom in and focus on communities that need to be served product and experiences in a unique way, the more of that attention and market share you can capture. So, there's this idea of, are we kind of too big or too big to fail? I think competition is great. And I think kind of what Nike's going through now with, having some market share be stolen, I don't think it is a bad thing. I think it gives Nike a chance to rise to the challenge and become stronger and more robust in some areas where maybe they've fallen behind. And so competition's a good thing. Unaddressed competition, it's either you sink or swim. You get stronger or you fall behind and flip a coin, and see what happens. But I think, yes, breaking out, and you look at, like the Jordan brand that's now, doubled just in the last 4 years, now doing over $7 billion in annual revenue. It's one of the largest sportswear companies. And Jordan was started out as, a sub-brand. It's still owned by Nike, but it started out as a sub-brand. And so, yes, I think the more brands you can kind of create and specialize, the more you can combat the other, niche companies as well.
So interesting. Well, let's wrap up with some, let's call it formal advice, because you've been sharing and dropping a lot of knowledge and advice all this conversation. And I wanted to kind of maybe frame it in a couple of different directions. Let's talk about TikTok and let's understand the new environment we're all operating in. And then second, let's talk about an environment where maybe you don't have the resources of a Nike. Maybe there's listeners there who don't have the kind of scale and scope. So what general kind of one or two pieces, 3 pieces of advice, if you're in a small, mid-sized enterprise and you're trying to transform and keep up with this disruption, what are your kind of 2 things, these things you got to do?
I'm going to be really boring here.
Impossible. For a guy in bright orange shoes.
The answer is the same regardless of how old your company is, what industry you're in, how early or late in your life you are,
how big you are.
It doesn't matter. The answer is the same. Do the basics really, really well. We overcomplicate things every day. I see it. I've been in it. I've been part of it. We overthink and overcomplicate things.
Wait, are you talking about me now? Or
all of us. We're all messy humans that try to overcomplicate things. And it's the KISS principle. Keep it simple, And when I think about, I'll go in and I'll talk to the CEO of a small to medium-sized company and they're trying to grow. My first question is, well, what's your business strategy? And I typically get some form of, we're working on this and we're trying to do this. And it's a little bit...
They're trying to keep up with disruption, right? This is their response to I got to go, I got to move, I got to do stuff, right?
Yes. But what's clear is their business strategy is not clear to me. And if the CEO can't tell me in a clear and compelling way what their business strategy is, guess what? Probably none of your employees can either. So when I say just having a business strategy on, what's your vision, mission, goals, priorities, that's like basic stuff. That's, hey, we're off to the races, but we haven't tied our shoes. I'm sorry, but you're going to trip, right? And so another part of the beautiful basics, the foundational fundamentals of doing good business is how are you leveraging data to make better, faster, and smarter business decisions? Most people don't have a good answer there. And these are simple things that there are very simple things you can do today in your business that will have an outsized impact and effect. And so the answer is not AI. AI is not going to save your company,
But we got all the way to almost half an hour before AI came up. That's a record actually these days.
Yeah, we do a little over/under betting thing with our guests.
That's incredible. That's fantastic. Let's talk about. I'm intrigued by your idea around the short form video, the TikToks of the world. Is it truly transformational? Is it changing the way people are consuming media and how brands need to think about not being the bigger magnet to change their orientation?
It is one of the biggest waves coming that I think nobody is paying attention to. There's a woman named Joanna Williams who has a company called Since Tomorrow, and she posts every day on LinkedIn on exactly what we're talking about. And she's if you're interested or you want to see more about the data or how big this wave is that most people aren't talking about, she's an interesting person to follow. It's huge. And what's interesting for me, going back to that comment where I'm smart enough to know I don't know much. I don't use TikTok, right? So I hear the stories, I see the data, I see the anecdotes. And when you look at businesses that are, average person at home starts creating videos using their iPhone, and they turn that into a business, and a month later they're doing like $1 million in monthly recurring revenue with no education, no background. TikTok is giving them the platform and the tools to do this. I'm sorry, but you can't ignore that, because there are all these sub communities out there that are doing this. It's a swarm coming, and the big brands need to take note and figure out how to get in on that, how to become part of that.
Fascinating. Well, listen, this has been a fantastic discussion. How do people get in touch with you if they want to tap into your wisdom or just keep up with things you have to say? Are you a LinkedIn person?
I do. I use LinkedIn and my website. I'm going through a refresh, Greg Merrill, GregMerrill.com. You can hop on and kind of see some of the work I'm doing these days. My hope is to do more podcasts. This type of stuff is fun for me. More speaking engagements. We're going to be up on stage here at RevTech, serving on more boards. And two areas, I know you didn't ask me this specifically, but I'm going to answer it. Two areas that I'm most excited about are advising CEOs and executives on navigating growth and transformation within their company. So that's exciting for me. And then the second part, we didn't talk about this much, but I partner with what I call brands of one, and this is mostly athletes and musicians, to refine their brand and build businesses around their brand so that they're well positioned for their long life after the playing field or the stage.
Fantastic. Very rich background. Well, listen, thanks so much for making time in a busy day here in the Scratch Event DJs podcasting studio here at RevTech. Looking forward to the panel between you two, which will be in the rearview mirror by the time this episode comes out. So maybe we can share some wisdom on that. But once again, thanks for joining us on Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Absolutely. Great being with you guys. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 9 will be available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.